So, moving forward, let's talk about the CLT. Let me introduce myself, but I haven't introduced myself. My name is Tarsila. I am the coordinator of CLT at Comcat. I'm a lawyer, but I am also an urban planner, and I have been around for approximately 5 years working together with some of you, many pilot communities, many partners to discuss CLT in our country. So, what is CLT? First, it's important that you differentiate the names. Today, you heard Fideicomiso de la Tierra, which is what we call the CLT in Spanish. You heard Community Land Trust, which is the term we use in English. And now you will listen to TTC, which is what we call that in Brazil. And you will see that all of these models in Puerto Rico, in the US, England, Brazil, they are all different because the needs are different in each place. In fact, they're different in each community. So today we will speak about the pilot communities that are present here today, and even in Rio de Janeiro, which is a part of Brazil. Even here, the CLT has differentiations. And so CLT is a generic name, but the way it works is we adapt it to the location. So today we're going to discuss CLT and the Brazilian model. So the TTC is the Brazilian version of the CLT, and it is a model that is adapted to Brazilian reality. And what does that mean? Well, you saw multiple photos today of developments in the US and in Europe that show houses that are middle class even. And this does not happen in Brazil. Here in Brazil, just like in Puerto Rico, as you heard from Mario, we have a focus on informal settlements, favelas, and illegal settlements as well, and in processes of self-building, so groups that build their properties collectively. And so these are the focuses of the CLT in Brazil. It's more centered around low-income communities. So this term, Community Land Trust, or TTC, the idea behind this term is an agreement between parts to establish collective governance over common property. And today we are going to discuss the main characteristics of the Brazilian CLT and say that to join the CLT is voluntary, it's optional. This is not a top-down approach. Every member has to voluntarily join. And this is crucial for maintenance, for the maintenance of this model. People can choose not to participate. And what are the specificities of the CLT in Brazil? What are the goals? Security of tenure is one of them. What is security of tenure? It is a guarantee that groups and communities can remain in their territories. We know, and we'll detail the context later, but we know that in Brazil, many groups, many communities live in extreme insecurity. They think they can be evicted at any time by armed groups, by the private market itself, because They can't pay their bills anymore, they can't pay electricity, internet. And so the Brazilian Community Land Trust addresses these challenges. But the goal isn't just tenure, it's not just to guarantee that communities stay in their territories. We also seek improvement, but from the perspective of residents, from their desires. So we know, and I'm sure some of you have examples of this, when improvements are suggested from the top, they're imposed, and that results in resources that are underutilized by the community. And so the CLT subverts that process. And it has a vocation for empowering residents to define the paths that the community will follow. And so these are the objectives of the CLT in Brazil. As Ashley already said, the CLT rose in the 1960s and was very much linked to the civil rights movement and the struggle of black people mainly to stay in their territories. It was a very complicated context. And in the past 60, 70 years, it moves from rural territories to urban ones. And it finally arrived in Brazil, in Latin America, where we have more recent experiences. But it's very important that we understand that the CLT model is present in many countries. We're not inventing the wheel here. What we're bringing to discussion here is the adaptation of a successful model, a model that's successful in several parts of the world. This is the map that Ashley brought today, which shows the number of CLTs around the US. We also have a map of the United Kingdom showing how disseminated this model is there. Now, here in continental Europe, we have other experiences in Belgium, Germany, France. Now Portugal is also trying to implement the CLT model. And so we have more and more countries who are interested. And in the global south, countries in development, as we used to call them, we have experiences in Kenya, Bolivia, Puerto Rico. As we heard from Mario and Barbara, we also have groups in Bangladesh, Indonesia, who are starting to work with CLTs. And here in Brazil, we have our own project. And so the CLT is a model that is so successful in so many diverse countries. I mean, we're speaking of Kenya even, that it has been included in the Urban Agenda, which is an international pact for cities and for urban policies. And Brazil is a part of it. Most countries are involved. And so the CLT has been acknowledged, has been recognized by the Urban Agenda, and has been considered a sustainable solution, a model to be discussed among all members. And so when we fight for CLT in Brazil, what we're doing is demanding a commitment that Brazil has already made internationally. And now we just need to put it in practice. And what are the essential characteristics of the CLT? What makes a CLT a CLT? And here we're going to address everything that was mentioned here today. So the CLT separates land ownership from ownership of buildings. And that is something that we're not very used to, at least not in Brazil. In Brazil, we tend to think of property, and property is everything. It's the land and the house, and that's what we're used to. But the CLT model separates those two. And we need to understand why the separation is important. And one simple exercise we can do to understand why that's important is I'm going to ask you to picture two identical houses. Imagine two identical houses. Put one of these houses in the wealthiest neighborhood of Rio or wherever you live. Now put the other house in the poorest neighborhood, the one that's farthest from the center. Will the price of those houses be the same? No. Why are the prices different if the houses are identical? Because of the land. And so there is a high cost that varies depending on the improvements, and that is related to the land, not the house. And so what happens in many of our communities, in favelas, for example, is that people fight for decades to get public investment, and after decades of struggle, the government comes and implements a school, a metro station, business start to come, and you gain this urban structure. And when that happens, what happens to the price of the homes? What happens to the poorest residents? They have to leave. The poorest have to leave because they're not able to pay the rent or the water bill or the internet. They won't even be able to get their beer because the beer that they're now selling is a different one, more expensive. And so this is what justifies a separation between buildings and land. Because through this model, the land belongs to the community forever. It cannot be sold. And so any type of increase in value will go to the community. And the houses, they can be sold, they can be rented, but they will always be rented and sold by affordable prices because the land belongs to the community. And this brings a protection against real estate speculation because many of you here live in areas of real estate speculation. And what do these developers want? They don't want your homes, they want the land. But if you can't sell the land, then they're not going to get what they want. And so with the CLT model, you have a double protection. First, because you have the title of your home and with that you're able to sell it. You have that protection. And you also have the protection of knowing that the land will be forever belonging to the community. It will never be sold. It will never be given to developers. And we're going to answer questions at the end. Please wait. And then the second characteristic is the spontaneous membership. I've already mentioned that. The CLT, unlike other models, it can't be imposed. We can't come to an area and say, we're going to do the CLT here, this is how it's going to work. We can't do that. And why can't we do that? Because the CLT is an arrangement that requires community engagement. And it is an intergenerational commitment. People who started in the United States in the 1960s, now their CLT is like third or fourth generation. And And so this needs to be something that you want to pass down to your children and your grandchildren. So it's something that you must want. It's something whose importance you need to understand. You need to understand that this is something that benefits you. And normally people ask, but so do I have to convince everyone in my community to have a CLT? And what I say is, not even Jesus convinced everyone. And so we cannot rely on persuasion. The CLT can be applied in a way that you can have one house here and then 2 streets after it, you have another house that is a part of it. Even so, the CLT protects communities. It protects members and the community as a whole. And do you want to know why? For this reason. Speculators, developers, they do not want the homes. They want the land. But do they just want one plot of land? No. They need several plots of land in order to have the area, the total area that they want. And so if you have scattered houses that are part of a CLT, you create a barrier for these developers because they won't be able to build, they won't be able to gather all of these plots of land. And so even if you have a CLT that is made up of scattered plots of land, which is very common actually, this is still a robust format for protecting residents and ensuring development that is community-led. The third point is affordability. I told you that the land stays with the community. And who owns the land? The community. And so it's the community that's going to decide what's going to be done. So you have the council, the elected council, but beyond the council, which is elected, you have arrangements of what we call direct democracy. What do we do normally with residents' associations? We elect a party, and then we either complain or we support for 2, 3, 4 years. And after that, we vote again. Isn't that how it works? But our level of engagement throughout the days is very low. We feel that we voted and therefore we can complain. But in the CLT, things work differently. The idea is to gather everyone to decide together. And so the City Hall wants to implement a project in the community. We have 3 options of project to implement. We're going to call everyone from the community to vote. And we're going to offer assistance if necessary. And, you know, it's hard work, but it ensures that everyone is able to give their opinion and participate in governance, which is so rich and important.
And so the last characteristic is the perpetuate accessibility to the housing. So it can futurely be school, anything, but you have to guarantee the accessibility of that house and land. And Ashley and Hazia brought us different stories of different communities where it shows that people cannot afford a house, afford rent. And we could see during the pandemics how many people were on the streets, living on the streets, because they couldn't afford a house. And the CLT guarantees you that that land will forever be destined to low income families. So if you want to sell your house because your life is changed now, you're married or anything, it doesn't matter. If you want to sell your house, you need to sell it to someone who's also low income. So just to show you on images how it works, this is the trust, and in the CLT we have the land that belongs to everyone, and each house is owned by any specific person. So why do you need to talk about CLT in Brazil? So we have some data about house owning in Brazil, and the last years showed us that the data is getting worse and worse. So in 2017, therefore before the pandemics, we have almost 8 millions of housing deficits in Brazil. But at the same time, we have almost the same number in available housings. So there are more available houses than people without houses. So it's weird having someone who lives on the street when you have an empty household. This is a political option for the housing as a real estate asset, as an investment. So, how many of you have received a propaganda that said this is a great investment, you should buy this house? But shouldn't our household be a home? Somewhere we can be to relax or even work when people work from home. So when did we get lost and the households became an investment? That's why we have a distortion, and the real estates became the reason why the speculator goes to the favelas and try to buy the land to then build a condo or apartment. So that's how people don't realize the the communities that live there and how they can collectively build something. So that's why we are working here in the CLT, and so we have to move our mindsets. So we have to think about household and houses as a right of the citizen. Because the houses are so important that we can't conceive someone who has rights and doesn't have a place to sleep. That's why we call them homeless. Is it possible to have a home on the streets? No. So that's why we can conceive someone not having a house as a houseless, because having a house is a basic right of the citizen. That's why we have to change our mindset, and that's our idea here, the CLT project. So those are some news pieces that made us think about this project. So in 2010, 2015, we had a real estate boom. So many of you remember not only the dismantlement And I bet you remember those removals from the Olympic Games and the World Cup. But I bet many of you also remember that before 2010, we could buy a house with much less money. And with the same money we had back then, we can even buy a house in not such a good area. So this makes people leave their houses. So in this context, the dismantlement wave, because of the huge events that were hosted in Rio and the intense real estate here in Brazil, made us realize that not even your title, your titling of the home, guarantees you stay there. And well, Dona Maria de Penha, that I bet many of you know, said, as you can see on the screen, that even her titling didn't guarantee that she stayed on the land. She had 2 concessions of use from the state, but to stay there on the land, she almost died. So do you think that the speculation doesn't go to the favelas? They go to the favelas because people don't have documents, so that's how you get yourself on this situation. So in this context, we start looking to other countries and think, well, someone must have thought about a solution to protect these residents. That's how we found the experience in Puerto Rico. That is the CLT model of the community land trust in a favela, in a poor community. So you can guarantee the land development. So when we found our fellow Puerto Ricans, we started to think that we can apply that in Brazil. So here we started to make those things happen and start to thinking about how we could bring the CLT to Brazil. And why do that? Why bring it to Brazil? It seemed that we didn't have any mechanisms that could guarantee the permanence in those communities. Even with all the laws and the constitution, we didn't have mechanisms to guarantee our permanence in the communities, but we needed the titlings because in one side it wasn't enough, and on the other side we could realize that people were still threatened even having the titlings. So we have until today a problem with public development because the state doesn't act. So we have a model in the city that made our mayor build many things for tourists. This model of a capitalist city that is going to be sold to the world, and this capitalist city doesn't have a place for the poor. So that's why we needed a mechanism to guarantee the CLT. So what were the potentialities we saw on the CLT? So the permanence guarantee, something formal, and I really mean formal, that would guarantee the permanence of those residents. Second, the CLT protects from both types of removals, from the real estate and the state, because before that it was impossible to protect from those two types. It guarantees that even on the low market, or when the market is at high, we can guarantee that people will invest in the communities. Besides that, the CLT brings a balance between individual and collective goods. So we have to think about everything as a collective community. So, but it doesn't work if you say that everything is collective, because that doesn't work. So the CLT guarantees that the land belongs to the community, because it's already like that, and the houses are owned by individual people. Beside that, CLT improves formally the community, so the community could decide on its own development and decide what they want to be done in that land. They are not subjected to someone from the city hall saying what they think should be done there. The CLT formalizes those communities and gives them the land owning. So that's why we use always the example of services communities, services companies, because sometimes you know that you don't have access to the basic needs. So with the CLT, the resident is not the one that is going to ensure that those needs are met. It's the CLT. That's only an example of how the community can be empowered. The CLT guarantees development by the residents and for the residents. So it's not someone else saying what it should be done. So we also have the accessibility of house owning. We want to guarantee affordable houses even if you don't own the land. We want the land to improve for those people who live there, not so they can get expelled and removed from the area, or everything gets so expensive they can't live there anymore. But of course, we have some challenges, and you brought everything.
Como eu falei,
Challenge is a lack of documentation. As I said before, the CLT is a legal mechanism authorized by the notary public, and because of that, we need a process called regularization. Our country historically has a history of regularization, and land regularization is a historic fight. Even though now we have some mechanisms that facilitate that, it is still a struggle. Another challenge that was very mentioned in the post-its is the control by armed groups. The CLT is a model. It is a proposal. It is a path. It is not the solution to all problems. Otherwise, we would be having a different type of conversation. Of course, there are places where we won't even be able to get in with this proposal because the control by armed groups is such that it makes it impossible. But the CLT does have mechanisms for reducing that type of control. How does it do that? First, through community empowerment. We have multiple studies that show that the weakened communities where residents are less united are those more vulnerable to control of armed groups. And one of our pilot communities is an example of that. It is a community that has been resisting thanks to the union of residents. The Council of the CLT advises that external agents be present. And so these are historic supporters of the community. Why their presence? To avoid the co-optation of this council. We know that sometimes people receive threats, and that is hard to resist. But that rarely happens with an external agent that is a historical supporter. And that is something that we use against the territorial control. And then there's the pragmatic argument, which is the following. Here's some news from 2020 and 20, and things have worsened since then. But the news was that 57% of the territories in the city were dominated by the militia. And so we could see how much power they have. Can any legal mechanism control that? Not really. The CLT cannot solve the problem of the militia. We can't solve this problem immediately, so we must invest in strengthening our communities. For those who don't know the story, in São Paulo, we don't have multiple factions like we do here in Rio. We have one group, which is the first command of the capital, that rules the entire city and negotiates with governors, the mayor. And people are appalled by the multiple factions that exist in Rio. And so the joke is that the PCC, the first command of São Paulo, should come here to dominate Rio as well. That would be a better situation. And so a challenge that we face in the CLT is the mindset of property and individualism. We live in a society that is more and more individualistic. We live in a society where, since we are kids, we're taught to desire to have our own home. Our dream is to buy our own house and to have our house title. But in reality, many times that's not possible, and many times it's not even the best solution for us. Many times it's good for us to stay in our communities where we have a support network than to just acquire property elsewhere. So we have housing policies that are based on the idea of individual property. And lots of problematic experiences come from that. We struggle to help people see that the collective is better and that they're in the condition that they are because it's because of a lack of communal effort. And there's a struggle to communicate that land needs to be owned by everybody. Peña says that land is a God-given gift and must be shared by all. It should not be sold. No one made the land. It was already there. And I think thinking about that is very important. But making everyone reflect about that is a huge challenge of our project. So, how do we implement the CLT in Brazil? I'm going to speak briefly about this, and I invite everyone to visit our website to find out more. But the CLT in Brazil is focused on informal settlements. So, favelas, occupations, but it can also be implemented in other types of housing projects, as long as it has the same ideology and the same vision of accessibility. There are stages of implementation of a CLT, which starts with community engagement, starts with residents hearing about the model, understanding it better, and opting to join or not. Then we have land regularization, the creation of a legal entity that's going to represent the community and will own the land. Later, the creation of a set of rules for the territory. These rules are decided by the community. And then finally, we have the separation between land ownership and property ownership, where each resident gets his individual title for his or her building. Now, it's important to understand the difference between the traditional property and the CLT property. And now I want to briefly talk about the project. You watched the video and it's a great summary of our story, but I want to talk about it in a more systematic way. So, at the end of August 2018, we brought our partners from Puerto Rico to come to Brazil to talk about their experiences with CLT. As Mario said, they're a community of 8,000 families in a central area of San Juan who were suffering with eviction threats from public authorities and the private market. And they were able to resist using the CLT. And so in 2018, they came to Brazil to share their experiences in this auditorium. We have some images of that event. Later, we created a working committee that divided itself in three fronts. The mobilization front, which works directly with communities. And today, we're working in 5 communities of Rio de Janeiro, which are shown on the map. I'm going to ask everyone who's from the communities to raise their hands. People of Trapecheiros, please raise your hand. Terra Prometida, please raise your hand. We have only a couple representatives. Anna's the one who's making breakfast and lunch. Conjunto Esperanza, please raise your hands. A pilot community since 2019, Shangri-La, are with us today. And Vila isn't represented today, unfortunately, but also works with us. Here are some photos of our activities. We always try to bring joy and fun to explain CLT. We're always together with residents, supporting local initiatives. And so the mobilization group devotes itself to that. We also have a group devoted to legislation. And what they do is propose laws pertaining to CLT. We don't need new laws to implement CLT in Brazil, and that's a victory for us because many countries that went through this process had to do that, but in Brazil, that's not the case in Brazil. Whoever has dealt with a notary public here in Brazil knows that the answer is always no for everything. And if it's not written in law, it's a definite no. And so we thought it would be useful to propose laws, propose bills. And so we have a process of political advocacy to get these laws approved. Right now, we're participating in the revision of the master plan of Rio, which is in the process of getting approved. We have in São João de Meriti the master plan that was approved. You saw that in the video. And we also have a promotion front. So what this group does is spread the word about the CLT to other parts of Brazil, because of course Rio is not the only place that with a housing crisis. There are many other cities in situations that are even worse than ours. And so promotion includes academic production, so the writing of academic articles about the model, technical assistance to groups that are interested in implementing the CLT, holding workshops online so that people can listen to these experiences and understand how they work, and political advocacy. We talk to those in charge. Yes, it's important to talk to those in charge. This was mentioned in the post. The CLT is something that communities can implement themselves. You don't need anyone's permission to do that. You don't need government permission. But of course, if you can talk to the people in charge and show the benefits of this model, that of course opens doors. And so communities can implement CLTs, but they can also rely on those who are in charge to make the journey easier. Here are maps you saw in the video. We were included in the platform for the struggle for housing. We participated in international events. We have on our website our annual reports. Some of you got the print version of our annual report, and it's very interesting. I again want to invite you to check out our website so you can follow the growth of our project and see how many people we're reaching, how many communities we work with, the number of academic articles written about us. And so this has permeated our path in the past 5 years.